Welcome back. I'm with Kevin Ikenberry, a retired military officer, as well as the author of The Crossing. Welcome, Kevin.
Hey, thanks, Sean. Glad to be here.
So I just wanted to start to just get folks familiar with your background. So just if you could start off with where you're from and your biography, and then we can start getting into your writing career and how you got started there.
Sure. So I actually grew up in northeastern Tennessee, Johnson City area, and went to school at East Tennessee State University. That was my commissioning source in ROTC back in 1992. And I was commissioned as an armor officer and went in immediately into the Guard and Reserve. I had a scholarship for guaranteed reserve forces duty. And then I went on to graduate school at Mississippi State. And from there, I went to work at Space Camp in Alabama and ran Space Camp for several years before I was recruited away to work with Challenger Learning Centers, which were learning centers created by the astronauts' families from the Challenger accident in 1986. So I've got about 25 years of experience in space and space science education. While I was at the Challenger Center in 2007, the Army called and said, "Hey, we'd like you to come back on active duty and be a space operations officer and help set up the 1st Space Brigade's reserve forces." And so as a major, I was brought back on active duty, spent the last 9 years of my career doing space operations stuff and getting of what we call Army Space Support Teams and becoming the senior reserve advisor for the 1st Space Brigade before I actually was medically retired in 2016. That's a whole other story we can get into. But then after that, I started writing in 2008 while I was ironically teaching ROTC. I had the opportunity to teach ROTC at a very prestigious institute called the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Terre Haute, Indiana. And if you're like me, I never heard of it before. I actually had the opportunity to go there. Rose is one of the top engineering schools in the country. It is private. And for the longest time, it was one of the primary feeders for the Army's Corps of Engineers. And as a result, they were actually one of the last institutions to drop the first 2 years for all students to participate in ROTC. It was a mandatory requirement there until I think 1993 or 1994. So they were literally one of the last institutions to drop that. So when I first came back on active duty, the space operations positions weren't ready yet, so I needed to have something to do. And I volunteered to teach ROTC, and immediately because of my space background, they asked me to go to Rose-Hulman, and it was one of the best assignments that I had. And it did kind of frame the work of the crossing that we'll talk about here in a little bit, because the crossing deals with Army ROTC cadets from around the 2008 timeframe, so it kind of works together. But I started writing. I had an idea for a book one afternoon at the office. I was a battalion XO, and I had a pretty good idea of the battle rhythm. I had my week pretty much down where I was capable of doing everything I needed to do staff work wise by about Wednesday afternoon for the week. And I just had an idea and started scribbling notes. And I went back on the campus and took a creative writing class. And the instructor asked me why I wasn't published. And that started my journey towards publication. So it's kind of been a long and interesting road, if you will.
What was your first publication? Was it a short story or a novel?
I sold my first short story in 2011, and it was not at a pro rate, but it was like a minor rate, I think, like at 1 or 2 cents per word, something along those lines. And then over the course of the next, let's say 10 years, I've probably sold about 50 short stories total, and several at the pro level at 8 to 10 cents per word. So it's been a good process as far as that was concerned. Sold my first novel in 2014. While I was recovering from an infection that was the course of my medical retirement. So in the process of doing that recovery is when I actually sold that book.
And let's talk about a little bit about that health crisis, if you're comfortable with it. Because I've heard this story before, but I don't know if the audience has or not. Most of them probably haven't. But it's unique, I think, is the right word to describe it.
It is a very unique experience. To frame this, I went back and looked at the data for 2014 from the Centers for Disease Control on this. And in that year of my particular, what happened to me, there were only about 300 cases in the United States that year. And of those, about 28 people died from what I actually had. So it was a fairly substantial.
10%.
Yeah, it was a pretty good mortality rate. So it was the Sunday of the President's Day weekend. It was a 4-day weekend. I was on active duty at the time, so I was going to have that Monday off. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon. I was with my youngest at that point. She was about 11 months old, and we had decided the family was going to divide and conquer errands. And so my wife and my oldest daughter had left. So I had the youngest, and we were getting ready to leave, and I was standing in my kitchen, and I felt like something bit me on my upper right thigh. And so I'm standing there in the kitchen. I dropped my pants, took a look, and I didn't find anything in my pants, like an insect or anything along those lines, but I had a welt about the size of a quarter. And so I did what any normal adult would do. I took a couple of Benadryl, thought, okay, everything's going to be fine. We'll go do our errands. So we go do the errands and come back about 3-4 hours later. We're watching TV, and I start to not feel very well. I feel like I have food poisoning, and I have the resulting vomiting and diarrhea. And this goes on well into the night. And about somewhere around 2 a.m, I started to run a fever. And not with, very young kids at that point, we were, trying to figure out a way to get me to the hospital. And then I actually fell asleep for the first time that whole night. I actually fell asleep. So my wife let me sleep for a little bit. I woke up about 7 o'clock that morning. I still had a fever. I was still very sick. And the welt on my leg had turned black. And so at that point, it was something where phone calls were made, kids were taken care of. My wife took me to the hospital. Thankfully got there. The waiting room was completely empty. And the triage nurse basically took my vitals and sent me right back. My heart was in arrhythmia. My kidneys had failed, and things were turning badly very quickly. And so we get back into the emergency room, and the attending physician comes in and he takes a look at my leg and goes, "Huh," and walks out. And that doesn't actually make you feel very good. He came back in with the on-call surgeon, and the on-call surgeon looked at it and said, "Were you bitten by a snake?" And I said, "No, nothing bit me." And so, because it was presenting in a way that was much like a rattlesnake bite. Mm-hmm. And so they left. And then the third guy that comes in is the infectious disease specialist who was on call. And he tells a great story of being an on-call physician. He was actually across the highway over at the Home Depot looking at spring gardening stuff when he gets the phone call from the attending that we think we have a necrotizing fasciitis, a skin-eating bacterial infection. And he talked about dropping everything he had in the aisle and running for the door because it's very rare. And so he walks in.
Wait, let me stop. So why did he drop the stuff? Because he was concerned about getting to you and getting you help, or he was so fascinated that he was going to get to see one of these things?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I also think, and we'll talk about my stay in the hospital, how I saw pretty much every medical professional, I think, in the entire state of Colorado over the course of 2 weeks. But I think it was a little bit of both, but it's also something that it moves very quickly. And so he came in, looked at my leg, and he had no idea what was actually the cause, but he immediately ordered the high drugs for MRSA, for staph, and for strep. And they admitted me to the ICU. And then I don't remember much of the next couple of days because I was on a high level of morphine. I was being pumped full of fluids. And then over the course of that time, my leg started to swell. And so my thigh basically swelled to about 3 times its normal size. I started to blister, and I make the joke that if you ever wanted to see a leg model for The Walking Dead, that could have been me. But at the same time, where that black spot had been opened up as a hole. And so it was certainly eating tissue. But we were able to, with thankfully being at the hospital early enough and catching it and putting the drugs into my system, they were able to essentially stop it. And I ended up being in the hospital for about 2 weeks. I ended up on at-home care for another 4 months. And then I was under his care for 14 months. And it actually took about from the time I was released from the hospital until the hole in my leg closed was about 5.5 months. So it was a considerable amount of recovery time. During that time, I found the Army was nice enough to promote me to Lieutenant Colonel, and then immediately tell me that I was going to retire. But it was something where, in their defense, I was immediately called non-deployable. I had to be, for the next 2 years, I had to be within 1 hour of a level 1 trauma center. I had to travel with high-powered antibiotics. So if I was, like when I went to WorldCon in 2016, I was still traveling with a big bottle of antibiotics, and I was checking my wound for heat twice a day. And because if once the infection started to degenerate, it would get hot. And I actually had a relapse about 3 months after the initial infection. So it was something to really kind of keep on top of. But yeah, as soon as the Army got all my medical documentation, they were like, "Yeah, you're done, dude." And I admit, yeah, there was a little bit of me that wanted to potentially stay, but I knew it wasn't going to be the same. I could no longer run. I could no longer jump. I couldn't do the things I always loved to do. I played volleyball in college, and now that's completely gone. So it's just one of those things. But it was pretty terrifying for a while. When I had my at-home nurse, she actually was a retired Army major, nursing corps, and she basically looked at me one day and said, "You know, if you had lived in some place like Gunnison, which is about 4.5 hours from here on the other side of the mountains," she said, "you'd have been dead." So I just was lucky enough to be able to catch it, get to the hospital, and have a fantastic medical team that saved my life.
Now, why 14 months? They just had to aggressively, because there's still some non-zero number of bacteria.
Well, they were looking for bacteria. They're also looking how the skin healed. If you're familiar with anatomy, there's an area. If you look at the areas of the skin, you have your epidermis, then you have what's called the fascial plane. That's below, above your muscles, but below the epidermis. And in this particular case, that infection basically ate the fascial plane on my right thigh. And so they were really looking at, is it persistent? Is it going to come back? Is it going to be something that we're going to have to watch for a period of time? So of that 14 months, I was on antibiotics for about 12 months of that.
Does that plane regenerate, or is it something you had to get skin grafts or?
I never had to have any skin grafts, thankfully. And with it being kind of like the tendons and whatnot, and that's probably not the best description. But if you think about the area of fat that you see sometimes on the top of a steak, that's fascia. And so what happened there was if you are actually able to feel my legs, the left leg and the right leg feel differently because that fascial plane is just not there. That little layer of fat is just gone.
Oh, wow. So does it get colder in the winter? And
actually,
sorry, I'm asking all the questions. You probably have you ask questions like this?
It's something where I don't notice it too much until I do certain things. It was kind of funny. As part of my recovery, they had me doing Pilates. And Pilates doesn't look like it's all that difficult until you actually start doing it. And the end of my first session, I'm laying in the studio like the dying cockroach, my hands and my feet in the air. And the instructor, he came over and he said, "Hey, I noticed you were having some trouble. What's going on?" So I told him, and he was just, his mouth's agape and like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe." And so he worked with me for a while just to help me get back to strengthening that, because as part of the, what happened with the fluid gain and whatever else, I ended up gaining about 50 pounds. I couldn't walk very well for a good month and a half, 2 months. So it was difficult to try to recover from all of that. And, I'd been an athlete all my life. So trying to recover from that was difficult because I had to sit down. I couldn't get up and walk around. And it was finally, I think, St. Patrick's Day, when my at-home nurse, she came by for a visit, and she said, "Why don't you go walk outside?" I'm like, "Where?" She goes, "Down to your mailbox and back." It's about 300 feet. And that was the longest 300 feet of my entire life. But that was when I was able to get out. So every day then after that, I went out and walked just a little bit to try to build that strength back. And by the time I left active duty, I was walking on the treadmill a good couple of miles a day, just to get back to feeling fairly normal, but it's still different from what it was.
And are you able to run anymore, or is that just out?
I think if I wanted to, I could, but it's at the same time, it's something where I'm very cognizant of the damage. Like, when we go hiking and stuff, if we climb an extreme incline, my legs just like, forget it. You're just not doing this. So it's something where I think if I had to like run from a bear or something, I probably could for a little bit, but it's not, I don't feel stable enough with it.
Now, what do you think caused it? You said you felt like a bite. You said you felt like a bite or something.
Yeah, we have no idea. It was something that was probably in my bloodstream. I had traveled to Japan for the Army a few months before, but they ruled that out. I had a cut on my ankle from where I'd stepped over the baby gate and hooked my foot, and they found strep A in that, but there was no evidence of infection or tracking up my leg. They really just don't know. It's just one of those things that just popped up and happened. And it ended up, over the course of my hospital stay, they ruled out MRSA, they ruled out staph, but then the infection responded to the drugs for strep A, which is the same virus that causes strep throat, but it can get in your bloodstream and cause cellulitis, but it can also, in extremely rare circumstances, cause necrotizing fasciitis.
So you think, in your opinion, it sounds like it might be the strep of the baby gate.
Yeah, that's what we think, but there was never anything definitive out of all the cultures. They could never pin it all down, which is just crazy.
Well, yeah, that is. I mean, that's the scary thing about the medical establishment, right? It takes a lot of credentials to get to that point, but at the end of the day, they're going to be presented with all sorts of symptoms and things that look like other things. Like you mentioned,
Hmm.
it looked like snake venom or
Yeah.
what snake venom would do, the effect after effects of snake venom. Sometimes you just get the wrong doctor. And I think it's the second. I think medical malpractice is the second largest cause of death in the United States. It's not listed as such because they don't want to report it, but I think it's either first or second, maybe third. So good thing you had a good doctor.
My team was fantastic. The surgeon that checked on me the first day, he every day I was in the hospital, he came by, even though he wasn't on call anymore. He came by to take a look. And we were asking him at some point during when the time they moved me to the medical floor to do the wound care, like, why do you keep coming back? He goes, well, I was kind of fascinated by it, but I was also watching that swelling, because if it had started to swell up my leg towards my core, they would have taken my leg.
Yeah, you got. I don't want to say you got lucky. I mean,
I did. No, I did.
You got lucky after you got it, but you weren't lucky to get that thing.
Yeah, it was kind of fascinating, scary, and it's something that I still kind of have to deal with the lingering after effects of. But I'm very, very grateful to still be here.
All right, so you wrote your first, or you sold your first novel in 2014. Tell me a little bit about that.
So I had written a first book that I knew was a god awful mess. And I was actually recovering from a foot surgery in 2012 when I had an idea for another novel. And so I ended up writing that over the course of the next year and a half in between duty assignments and whatnot. And I had just finished the first draft of that before I had gotten sick. And during my recovery process, we had a finished basement in the house we lived in there, and that was my area, because I had a nice comfortable couch. I had a television. We had basically a mini kitchen and a bathroom. It was all within about 10 feet of me, so I could get up and I could move just the very little bit that I could, and be able to take care of all those things without trying to manipulate stairs and whatnot that we had in the house, which would have been a nightmare. And so it was one night while I was in the recovery process where I just decided it was time to get back to work. So I went back, started going through that manuscript, and I would imagine by, let's see, probably the April timeframe, maybe April, May, I had it in a position where I was going to go ahead and send it out. So I reached out, sent it out to a couple of publishers. Got one nibble from a very small press, and they had they had a contract that I didn't like, and fortunately I'd gone to the Superstars Writing Seminar in 2014, actually the week before I got sick. And as part of that, Eric Flint used to give a class on contracts. And he would take one of his Bain Books contracts that was completely unredacted and go through it clause by clause and tell you what you're looking for, what's really good, what the industry people will sometimes throw at you, or how they'll try to grab certain rights or whatnot. And it was a fantastic class. But at the end of that class, he made a promise that if you ever had a contract that you didn't like, to send it to him. And so when I got that contract from that publisher, there were a couple of red flags that were, kind of tickling the hair on the back of my neck.
Did they ask for all your movie rights?
No, they wanted life of copyright, which is a huge no-no, but which is your life plus 75 years, and then there were other things in there too. But I wrote Eric an email and just said, hey, that thing you talked about, take a look at a contractor. Were you serious about that? And Eric was like, send me the damn contract. So I sent him the contract, and he writes me back, and basically about.
By the way, you do a good Eric Flint impression. God bless his heart. Bless his heart. I hope he's smiling from heaven right now.
I will. I love Eric. I will miss him greatly. But doing his voice is something that kind of will continue to perpetuate the legend that he was. So he sends me back an email. It's basically a master's class on how to read contracts. And so later that summer, I got a second offer from the eventual publisher of the book. And I thought the contract looked pretty good. Eric was actually out of the country on a cruise. And so I ran it past another friend of mine, Kevin J. Anderson, and he was like, yep, this is a good one. So I signed that contract and sold the book.
And what book was that? What was the title?
That was Sleeper Protocol. So
Okay.
it was my first military sci-fi, kind of more on the thriller side book. It had a sequel that came out about 18 months later called Vendetta Protocol, and then I ran into some business issues with the publisher that I would rather not get into. It ended up being a personal decision for me to get the rights back, which I did last year, and now we're going to actually put those two books back out starting actually in about 2 weeks. The Sleeper Protocol will come back out from Chris Kennedy Publishing, and then Vendetta Protocol comes out in, I want to say, the end of September. And then the third book that was previously unwritten that I finished after I got the rights back, called Eminence Protocol, comes out in November.
Okay. And after those three books, is what else did you put out?
So right after that second book had been written, Vendetta Protocol, I got I had met Chuck Gannon at the WorldCon in Kansas City in 2016. I'd been invited by Kevin Anderson to sell books in his little traveling bookstore he had at the time, and I was positioned right next to Chuck, and we got to talking, and really we became really good friends over the course of that weekend. And Chuck had offered to blurb Vendetta Protocol, so he did. And then immediately thereafter, he was at a convention back east and sat down with Chris Kennedy and Mark Wandry, who had created the Four Horsemen universe. And they were 4 books in at this point. Each of them had written 2 books, and they were undertaking a project with a 5th book to create an anthology where they could bring in new authors to potentially widen out the universe and tell new storylines. And in the process of their conversation with Chuck, where they were asking him to be the right to forward for the anthology, he asked them if they had heard of me. And of course, they had said no. And Chuck said, "You might want to send him an invite." And so Chris Kennedy sent me an email, completely sight unseen, never heard of me or whatever else, but just on Chuck's recommendation. So they sent me the information for the anthology. I turned in a story that focused on the peacemakers of the Four Horsemen universe, which is essentially the law enforcement branch, if you will, or arm. And I got an email back from Chris about 3 hours after I sent the story in that was, "Hey, we love this. Can you write a book?" And so I wrote the first book there. After I wrote Peacemaker, they offered 2 more books in a contract, and then I became what's called a core author. So there's 6 of us that basically control the Four Horsemen universe. And so if anybody wants to come in and write a storyline and it has anything to do with the Peacemakers, it comes through me. And now I think in the universe I've written 10 books, written or co-written, and I'm working on 2 more right now with my friend Jason Cordova. So that's been a fun process. I did finish that first book I ever tried to write that was called Runs in the Family, which is military sci-fi. It has a prequel that I also wrote called Dereliction of Duty. And then I have a book that I'm really proud of that hasn't reached a whole lot of people, unfortunately, but Elmore Leonard was one of my literary heroes. Leonard, of course, wrote a lot of Westerns like 3:10 to Yuma, wrote the books behind the movies Jackie Brown, Out of Sight, Be Cool. He was a fantastic author with his own particular style. And I really wanted to meet him at some point, but unfortunately he passed away. I think it was in like 2012, maybe 2014. I can't remember exactly when. But not getting a chance to meet him, I had an idea for a book that I wanted to write that was kind of like an homage to him. So I wrote that. It's called Super Sync. And it follows a group of unsavory characters that you don't know exactly who to root for in the midst of this really shady operation where you really figure out who's made of what and who the person is that you really want to see win. So very, very much like a Leonard story. I like to think I pulled that one off. And then go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say then we have the story of The Crossing. So,
all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about The Crossing. So, roughly, what's it about? What inspired it? And you alluded to some of it, kind of the inspiration piece, but say more.
So to put the Crossing into the log line to encapsulate it, it's November 2008. A group of Army ROTC cadets are conducting training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, when they're struck by an acidity shard, which is one of Eric Flint's time events. And it was the same kind of thing that created the Granville experiment or the Granville situation with 1632 and whatnot, the Alexander incident and whatnot. And so they're hit by this time shard. They're transported about 7 miles to the northeast, but 232 years into the past. They're immediately jumped by a Hessian patrol. They take casualties and they lose a modern M16 to the enemy. That becomes their catalyst to end up reporting to General Washington and changing the course of American history. The idea for this story was one of those things that as a writer, and I know you've probably done this too, when I was really starting out with writing, every time I got a crazy idea, I'd write it down on a piece of paper. You're going to scribble down this little snippet of an idea. And my idea that I wrote down was, so reputedly, George Washington threw a coin across the Delaware River prior to the landing. And I thought, well, what if that coin was actually a bicentennial quarter? And I wrote that note, had no idea what to do with it. So back at that same Superstars in 2014, I had the opportunity to have dinner with Eric Flint. And there's a table full of folks at the dinner, and where everybody's talking, and Eric was such a gracious host. And at the end of the night, we're standing there putting on our jackets, getting ready to walk back across to the hotel. And I just, for whatever reason, I just decided I was going to go for it and ask the question. So I said, Eric, I've got a question. So I've got this idea that's been banging around in my head, and it's alternate history, and I don't know what to do with it because it's not what I would feel like I could write. And Eric's like, well, what's the idea? And so I tell him, and his eyes light up, and he goes, let's go to lunch tomorrow. And so we go to lunch the next day, and he basically starts mentoring me at that point on how to look at writing alternate history. And over the course of about, again, with me being sick, and then Eric had a bout of cancer in this time frame, it took about 3 years for us to get to the point with my discussions with him where he finally looked at me and said, you need to get me a manuscript. And so I ended up writing the manuscript, that first draft, in 2017. And then we were intending that Eric was going to actually have a companion story that was going to come along inside the book as well, that follows some of the characters that I had created in our current timeline. Eric was unfortunately not able to get that in time with his health problems before his passing, but I hope that we'll actually see that come out sometime soon, because it does kind of set things up with where we were going to try to go with this overall storyline. So that's the basic gist. You have a group of 8 Army ROTC cadets. They're very diverse. They have different backgrounds, different experience levels, and now they find themselves in colonial America with the knowledge that they have of what's about to happen and what could change the world.
In this universe, is it as if this is part of our history, or does this alter? I mean, in other words, yeah.
Every time there's an City Shard event, like so the first one that Eric wrote about in 1632, it takes Grantville back to 1632 Eastern Europe. It basically creates a separate reality. So it's just these events are pulling out of the current timeline, but they create their own essential parallel universe. So while people that were remaining here in what we would call our uptime, right, the people that are now downtime, they're creating something else that will run forward in that parallel universe going forward. It's kind of fun to play with.
Well, it's likely how quantum mechanics actually works.
Very much so.
Right. Everything's happening simultaneously, and whatever parallel timelines are, they're not necessarily interfering. They're just separate, different frequencies, waves, whatever you want to.
Yep. Separate events, separate timelines, doing their own thing essentially. Yep. That's exactly right.
Okay. And then what types of readers would you recommend this to? So people who enjoy, kind of Grantville Gazette type stories, I'm sure is part of it.
Absolutely. I think anybody that's a fan of Eric's work would certainly enjoy it with the different Ring of Fire novels. Everything that's been done has kind of touched on this particular, this mechanism, if you will. So I think that anybody that likes any of those books would. If you like American history, I did a tremendous amount of research on this book. It's something we can chat about in a minute, because I learned things about the Battle of Trenton and the days running up to the Battle of Trenton that I had no idea about from my schooling, including my military history classes that were mandatory in the course of my ROTC program. There were just things that we didn't cover or that we didn't know. And so getting deep into those inner workings of the situation was really fascinating. And the deeper I got into it, the more places I found where I could actually have the cadets have impacts just on, again, the knowledge that they have, but how their own values and the things that they learn in a very modern sense would be translated in that time frame. So it was really cool to be able to do. So if you're an alternate history fan, Eric Flint's work, Harry Turtledove's stuff, anything along those lines, I think would be right up there. If you just like a good thriller that's it's got a second half that just kind of blows your mind. It's very fast paced. And a lot of connections come about. I think anybody that likes those types of books would enjoy this.
Is there any room for a sequel?
I'm hopeful. So I have the green light to start developing ideas, and I have notes on where I would like to go and things that Eric and I had talked about as far as being able to tell a story like this over multiple books. Ultimately, it's going to come down to the reception from fans and whatnot, and I'm hopeful that we do get the opportunity to pursue it, because this book basically covers about a week of time, and I would love to get into the future events of, say like in the very next year in 1777 with the Battle of Saratoga, for example. What might the cadets know or not know there that could have an effect, positive or negative, on the outcome? If it was a negative outcome, do the French enter as our allies in the American Revolution? Who knows? So there's a lot of things that you could play with, and I would love the opportunity to keep going in this universe. I think it would be fun.
And what sort, or where can folks find these books?
So this book is worldwide. So Barnes and Noble, Google Play, any place where you can buy a book, you can actually find this information. So you can find The Crossing. Go to a bookstore. If it's not on the shelf, you can certainly talk to them and order it, or what they call shortlisting, to bring it into the store. And again, it's on Amazon. It's on any of those online retailers, so you can get it within a day or two if you're interested.
And what sorts of advice would you give to new authors who want to break into writing novels and selling novels?
Dude, this is about 5 shows in and of itself. And you've been down this road too, and you understand. So I'll pick a couple of things. The first one is find mentors. I think for me, being able to write, I'd been told I was a good writer, and I had done really nothing with it until I started that initial story idea. And being able to meet folks like Eric Flint and Kevin J. Anderson and David Farland really, really focused my efforts and my ideas of what I wanted to do as a storyteller. I have another mentor, Lou Anders, who was the editorial director at Pyre Books for a while, is now a very successful middle grade author. Lou coached me on story structure and character development, to the point that was the thing that set my novel apart for Sleeper Protocol when it was purchased. I really think that was a huge learning environment for me, was to be able to take what I had learned from Lou, apply that to that manuscript, and then be able to present it for publication. The impact of a mentor is critical. It's something where the relationship with a mentor is not like a bitch and moan session. It's not going to be something where I would pick up the phone and I would call Eric and I would whine about, why can't I do this? Because Eric wouldn't put up with it for the first thing. But he would also tell me basically to just shut up and get back to work. Because the idea is, as a mentor, you've taken someone that has an interest and has passion and has drive, and you have to get them over the obstacles. And the obstacles, and oftentimes, are right here in our own heads. And so once you've got that taken care of, that's a major step forward. So finding a mentor is huge. I think I'm a huge believer in story structure. I wrote a nonfiction book on story structure last year because, again, of what I learned with Lou and what I learned in starting to look at different story structures. Writers typically fall into 2 categories: plotters and pantsers. And pantsers, someone that writes off the seat of their pants.
By the way, that was my next question. So good job.
So yeah, no problem. So I basically straddle that line pretty well. I'm a plotter, but I always leave room for my characters to do things. I'll come back to that. But the idea being with story structure that I found was all of the current really modern trendy story structures have the same critical beats and elements. They're presented in a different context with a different name, and those different names get people confused. So if you're used to, for example, using 7-point story structure, and somebody comes up and says, well, Save the Cat says that this beat is named this, you're completely frozen. And then you have to go and you have to learn another story structure, and then you're not writing the damn book. So my idea was to look at, with story structure, being able to navigate people through understanding how all these beats just have different names in different contexts. They're the same thing. And it's fun to be able to watch people when I give classes, or when people have read the book and sent me a note and be like, you just completely solved something that's bothered me for 3 years, because they get stuck on something with, understanding that, oh, well, you have to use this current trendy story structure because it's the one. And that's not the case, because they're all the same. And I think that as you go along and write, I also think that, most people feel like an outline is a ball and chain. If I create an outline, I have to stick to this outline. Everything is written in stone. I cannot mess with this. I disagree with that. I think that as you write, every once in a while, you're going to create a character, you're going to create a situation where, as you're writing, your subconscious is changing things. And your subconscious is taking this and saying, what if you do this? An example from one of my books, I was writing Fields of Fire, which was one of my 4 Horsemen books. And I had this planned out where I had a pair of peacemakers, and one was what's a Vitanho in our universe, the species is reviled. They're terrible. They're dishonest. They've been behind a lot of the machinations that are going to take down parts of the mercenary guild. They're just terrible creatures. But I created this peacemaker, and she was very honorable, and she was teaching a young human who was kind of a jerk, just kind of entitled, didn't really see the benefits to doing the job to the extent that he could. So I had this kind of odd couple vibe going, and I'm writing through this book, and I was bound and determined that I was going to kill the young human to prove what the other one was doing was right, that she was right in the way that she was mentoring him. And I'm writing this book, and I'm right to that scene, and it's one evening after the kids and my wife have gone to bed, I'm sitting downstairs on the couch, and I'm gonna write the death scene, and I freeze, and my subconscious is like, no, flip it. You need to kill her. And I just kind of, it was one of those moments where I just kind of thought about it for a second. I thought, all right, I'll do it. So I started writing, changed the script, and I'm sitting there and I'm bawling. I'm crying as I'm writing the scene, because I recognized about halfway through the scene what I was doing was exactly what needed to happen. And it was one of those really powerful moments that, I've had a lot of readers that have told me, hey, you totally got me with that. Here's this being that we're supposed to hate, and her death scene is so powerful, and it's so impactful on the cast of characters that it captures the audience, their emotions as well. It was sometimes I tell this story. I teach one of my classes where I talk about my dad not talking to me for 4 days because he texted me the character's name after he read the book, and I wrote back. I was like, yeah, I kind of had to do it, and he didn't respond. And I called him. He's like, I'm not speaking to you. So I do think there's a place sometimes where your brain as a storyteller is going to tell you the plan you've got is good, but go this way just a little bit more. And so that's why I say I do the plotting, but I always leave myself a little bit of room. And it's something where if a character's going down a rabbit hole that I don't like, I just yank them back. And I just throw that scene or two, whatever I've written, it's out, or make the changes that need to happen to it so I can keep going from there.
Now, how many passes do you usually go through a novel? How many drafts?
So most of the time, I'll do the first draft, that's just my brain dump. Then I'll do a read through pass, and then I'll make edits and revisions to that read through pass, and that's just typos and grammar and stuff. And so then when it's clean, then I will go through the second pass, and that's where I'm really looking for the story structure and the current, not the current. The sequence of events that I want to happen. Are things in the right order? Am I following the character's stories logically? That sort of thing. And then once I've got that done, then I'll just do a third polish pass, and I will send it to my first reader.
And about how long does it take you to write a novel?
So the first novel I ever tried to write, which ended up becoming Runs in the Family, that one took me 18 months because I had no idea of story structure. When I did the story structure work with Lou Anders, I ended up writing Sleeper Protocol in about 8 weeks. And so right now, my current timeline with a novel is I can write a novel pretty much in 3 months.
Okay, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. From outline to complete.
Yeah, from outline to end of third pass off to first reader is typically about 3 months.
Okay, yeah, I find outlining actually sets me free, because especially with novels, even I'm probably one of the only people who outlines short stories too. Because if I don't know where I'm going, I just stuck. I flail. Mm-hmm. But I do leave enough room that, it better be there better be a really strong reason for me to switch, and I'm less likely to do it toward the beginning, because that just completely changes your outline. But it definitely just makes it easier, because you know what you have to do. It's easier to separate the problem and complete it in different pieces. So
yeah, I completely agree. And when I go through doing stories like short stories, I always start with the end in mind. What do I want the ending to be, and then I backtrack to what the very beginning should be, and then I can kind of map out certain plot points that would need to happen between those two. And that room is always there, and sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. There have been times, just in recently, I think I have a story coming in an anthology from you next year that. Yep. I wrote that story pretty much in one setting, and it didn't necessarily change. There were a couple of things from a detail perspective that changed when I went back through and polished it. But that one was just, I knew what I wanted to do, and it just kind of flew out. Every once in a while, I think, so let's talk writer's block. I think writer's block sometimes is where you're so wrapped up in what you think a character should do when they actually might want to be doing something different, or there's something that you've plotted out that doesn't necessarily match up with what your subconscious is thinking the story needs to do. I think everybody that writes, and everybody in general, has a pretty decent idea of what story structure already is. It's been passed down to us for thousands of years since telling stories around campfires. And so if you've ever been that person that's in a movie or watching a television show and you know what's going to happen next and it does happen, you understand story structure because we've been conditioned to it. And so I think that as you're going along, if you've plotted something out and you've got this really great idea, but your brain is saying this doesn't work, I think that's what gets people stuck sometimes. And so I think that's one of the things that I always try to coach people on of, if that's happening to you, put down that manuscript, go do something else for a little while, then come back to it and let your brain figure out exactly what's wrong. And most of the time you're going to figure out what it is in the course of writing something different.
Well, that's also one thing that I do. You talked about flipping the script, and that typically happens to me in short stories when I get to the ending. I'll get to the ending that I planned, and then the right ending will come to me, which will typically be not an adjustment to that. It just ends up being another paragraph. Unfortunately, when I do that, the stories always become darker because, I just did this in Robo Soldiers. I had a story in there called Manchurian, and I got to kind of, happy, again, most of the reviews that are coming out are just be like, mine has trigger warning. It's basically like, warning, this story is very dark. But what happens is I'll come up with something at the very end. Like, I'm like, oh, this reminds me of this, one of the 36 stratagems, which is like a Chinese thing. I'm like, oh, so I'll put that here. And then I got to the end and I started inserting all these references to different stratagems. And then the entire story at the end basically is like the stratagem that happens at the very beginning or something like that. It's been a while since I looked at it. So that's always, I think, when I get what I think are my best endings is you make that, but it doesn't totally alter the structure. The structure's always been there. The ending's always been there. Your subconscious just has to attach it to the conscious, and you get a good answer.
Yeah, I agree. And don't get me wrong, there are people that do very strict outlining, that stay with that strict outlining because they've really got an idea of what they want to do with that character and they've really thought it through. In my particular case, I think things through, but I always like to, because I've seen it happen with my own writing over time, that there's going to be something that my brain is going to say, add this, and then extrapolate on that, and then you're able then to craft something that's a little bit different, a little bit something that's got a little bit more emotional resonance to the reader, which is huge.
And that's why I think, as you stated, you do multiple drafts. That's one of the primary reasons you do that, because that's when these things come to you, because you finally, after reading it 6 times or however many times you reread it, that's when these ideas start to come to you. Mm-hmm. And because you have everything in your head and you start to really, really know the characters, and that's when it starts to happen. All right. So last question.
Actually, can I throw something in on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the best pieces of writing advice I ever picked up was actually from Stephen King's book on writing. And King talks about when he's done with a project, it literally goes into a drawer, and sometimes for months at a time before he looks at it again. And I have had more success with that, so that if I finish like a short story, like for example, when I wrote the one for you, I wrote it, got done with it. I think I sat on it for 4 or 5 days before I came back and read it with fresh eyes, and was able to go in and figure out what needed to change, what I needed to, polish up a little bit. And then it was done. I think that having that time away is huge. There's folks that they'll finish a draft and they'll go right back into the first draft. My advice is no, take a couple of days off, go read a book, go do something different, then come back to it with fresh eyes, because that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And that's the other thing I find too. The first draft of anything I write is terrible. And then by the time I kind of go through it a few times, then you start to love it again. You start to love the original idea. So it's a pride. You feel like you're never going to finish it too. You're like, oh, I'm 3/4 of the way in, and it's not good. I don't know. Yeah. So, which is why you have to outline, because you're like, look, I just finish the outline. Just grind through it, and you'll get there.
Yeah, right, the middle of every book sucks. So it's just the way it goes.
All right, last question. What other authors would you recommend, both alive and dead?
So I actually had this question on the podcast the other day. So I've always gravitated back towards Arthur C. Clarke. I've always enjoyed Heinlein's works. From the military sci-fi perspective, David Drake. I always kind of devoured the David Drake books.
You're going to be in an anthology with one of it might be his last story.
Yep. So, being able to let's see. I mean, Chuck Gannon is a friend of mine. He writes the kind of science fiction you cut your teeth on, which is really fantastic. It's been fun to play in his universe as well. There are, let's see, from the thriller side of things, Jonathan Mayberry is a fantastic, not only guy, he's a fantastic writer. He's one that I highly recommend. There are folks outside of, like my favorite book outside of science fiction and fantasy is actually The English Patient by Michael Ongeday. Just from the prose is just amazing. If you ever want to feel like you're not a writer, read that book, because man, his ability with words is really, really pretty phenomenal. But I mean, my bookshelves are full of all kinds of stuff. I mean, I read a lot of Stephen King. I read a lot of W.E.B. Griffin, who's talking about military fiction. Read a lot of like the books by Michael and Jeff Shara, Killer Angels, Gods and Generals, The Last Full Measure, those books. So yeah, we could talk for another hour on the different books that are on my bookshelf, because it's a very eclectic thing. And I think that's something that I've always tried to do is read outside the genre and be able to do different things. And you'll be surprised at how something that you're not, like reading an Elmore Leonard story, for example, something that Leonard writes will find its way to influence something that I do in a scene, because it's just something that I've read. And it's something that, that sticks with you. And I think the books that stick with you over time are the ones that you do tend to keep on your bookshelves. They're not the ones you take to Goodwill or whatever else. And they're the ones that every once in a while you're going to reach back and pull in. I think the other thing that I do from a writing perspective is when I'm working on a project, I read a lot of nonfiction. So, and that's not necessarily nonfiction about story structures and that sort of stuff, biographies. Like one of my favorite ones to pull down, particularly if I'm working on a military sci-fi project, is I'll pull down War as We Knew It by Patton. It's kind of required reading for guys like you and me, but it's just there's certain things that you just kind of go back and wrap around yourself like a nice warm blanket.
Have you ever read Attacks by Rommel and Achtung Panzer by Heinz Guderian?
So a long time ago on Achtung Panzer, but then I definitely read Rommel and Patton both.
Yeah, definitely. And then of course, On Guerrilla Warfare is a good one by Chairman Mao.
Yeah.
Right? or I can't remember exactly what it was called. But,
I haven't read that one.
But it's it's about fighting the Japanese and guerrilla tactics and things like that. So, all right, my friend, it was a pleasure having you on the show, and everybody should go out and order The Crossing immediately on Amazon, or just go to your Barnes & Noble and tell them to make sure that they have it in the store. So
absolutely.
All right, my friend, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, man. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.